Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. Our webinar on right-wing extremism and hateful conduct in the CAF. This is a second in a series of webinars we'll have on this issue. We are actually the network. It's a very long title for the network, so bear with me. The network on research. The Network for Research on Right-Wing Extremism and Hateful Conduct in the CAF. So with us today from the network, we have David Hofmann, Dr. David Hofmann from UNB. We have Dr. Yannick Veilleux-Lepage, currently at Leiden, and Tracy Campbell, who's our coordinator for the network. We also have with us Carmen Celestini, who I'll introduce more formally later on, who is a PDF, not on the network, but on the related targeted engagement grant looking at policy specifically. So those are the members of the network we have with us, and I'll introduce the speakers in just a moment. But first, of course, the usual housekeeping rules. Please do keep your video on, or sorry, audio and video on mute as we go along. And if you're not speaking, amongst the panelists, if you're not speaking, keep at least your audio on mute. Feel free to keep your beautiful faces on screen. Happy to see you. And I think the other important thing is that there will be time absolutely for questions at the end. So please do use the question and answer function for that. And Tracy will be monitoring that. So, put the questions up at any time. And we will come to them at the end. And I think Yannick is actually going to moderate the questions for us. So looking forward to that. Really do want this to be, fully engaged, fully interactive, and get a sense of what the audience is interested in. And that I think will help us to think about how to move forward with our research and recommendations down the road. Just to give you a little bit of background, I guess, on the network, we, as the name implies, we are a research-based network that also includes members from Organization for the Prevention of Violence, as well as, a number of other colleagues. And you can go to our website, which Tracy will put the URL up in the chat room. You can go to our website and see who our partners are. We've sort of built out from the outset. And so we are very much interested in looking not just at the policy elements associated with responding to right-wing extremism within the CAF, but in fact, taking a deep dive, the first comprehensive academic deep dive into the dynamics of right-wing extremism within the CAF to get a sense of what the level of awareness is, if to whatever extent we can, what the level of engagement is or might be. Also sort of taking it beyond active duty and looking at veterans as well and the extent to which they might be vulnerable to recruitment. So it's a pretty wide-ranging project. 3 years for the network, and hopefully if all goes well, beyond that as well. I think I see it as a long-term initiative. It's such a moving target, the right-wing extremist movement in particular, that I think at different points in time we're going to see different dynamics. So I think it's important to sort of maintain that level of observation and engagement. So I think, Tracy, I don't think I've missed any housekeeping rules or anything. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to the reason that we're here, and that is to hear the voices of our panelists. So I'm just going to introduce you all at the beginning and in the order of presentation as well. So we have first Emil de Waal, who is the Acting Director of Military Personnel Policy Integration. DMPPI are owners of the policy development framework within the Chief of Military Personnel, and as such provides guidance and coordinative support to various policy centers and stakeholders to help ensure that their policy efforts adhere to the developmental requirements. I'll never get used to these acronyms within the military. Dr. Carmen Celestini is currently an instructor at the University of Waterloo in the Religious Studies Department and Arts First program. She's also, as I mentioned, our postdoc fellow on the Targeted Engagement Grant around right-wing extremism in the CAF, in particular looking at policy mechanisms. Her research is predominantly in the field of religion and social theory, with a focus on improvisational conspiracy, the overlapping belief systems of apocalyptic Christian thought and conspiracy theories, and the impact of these beliefs on the American political system. In her doctoral work, the focus was on the John Birch Society of the 50s and 60s and how their form of improvisational conspiracism was linked to contemporary right-wing mobilization. Her interdisciplinary work also includes religion and pop culture, specifically within subversive or marginalized new religious movements. Dr. Alan Okros is a full professor in the Royal Military College Department of Defense Studies and currently employed as Deputy Director of Research in the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security, and as a Special Advisor, Chief Professional Conduct and Culture. As a researcher on leadership, gender equality, and diversity, Dr. Okros has contributed to a range of Canadian and international projects to achieve equality objectives and to enhance military operational effectiveness. As a policy entrepreneur, Dr. Okros advocates for evolutions in military understandings and approaches to diversity and inclusion within the CAF and internationally, including involving the military in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Bolivia, Singapore, and South Africa. Need to talk to you more about those pieces. He has provided policy options for more inclusive approaches for those who are marginalized based on gender identity or sexual orientation, including the requirements to address adverse aspects of military social construction and harmful use of social power. So I welcome you all and thank you all for joining us and taking the time to share your thoughts with us. So we will begin with Emil.
First of all, thanks for that lovely, warm welcome. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour à tous. My name is Emil. As was previously stated, I'm very happy to be here, especially given the amount of horsepower that's in this virtual room, to provide some insights and broad brushstrokes as to how the hateful conduct policy was developed within the Canadian Armed Forces. Just real quick, full disclosure, I'm zooming in here on my phone, so if you're seeing too much face, I apologize. Hopefully we'll have the presentation deck up here so we can kind of distract you folks here. Is the deck up? I can't really tell right now.
Yeah, I can share it in a moment.
Fantastic.
Oh, actually, Barb, you have to share it. Barb, can you hear me?
Hang on, I just closed that file. I'm going to have to open it again.
Sorry, it's disabled on my end, so.
Oh, let me just, it's probably easier. You've got it up. I'll just, all panelists, and then I'll just change that at the end. So you should be able to go ahead and share now.
Okay, perfect. I think we're there. Hang on. Now, what am I looking for here? Where is?
You've got it up, so just go up to
There we go.
slideshow. There you go.
There we go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tracy. I'll just ask that you go to the second slide, please. All right, perfect. So just a quick review of the headlines of how this brief is going to go. As mentioned earlier, I'm within the Director of Military Personnel Policy Integration. I'll just give a quick overview of who we are, what it is exactly we do, and how we fit in the hateful conduct policy development process. And then I'll dive right into the hateful conduct realm itself in terms of the background, what kind of triggered the production of this policy, the CAF objective at the time, what our policy approach was. I'll quickly skim over the definitions, components, and some of the examples that we put in there, the reporting and tracking modifications that we made as a result of all of this, and then some of the communication efforts that we implemented and that is currently ongoing. Next slide, please. So who we are. As mentioned, Directorate of Military Personnel Policy Integration. Integration is the key piece there as we try to coordinate with all the various stakeholders across the CAF in developing policies. As many of you are aware, the Department of National Defense is very large with many different organizations. And a lot of these different organizations have a great deal of autonomy to effecate their operational effectiveness on the ground and remove a lot of the bureaucracy found in the the NDHQ process. So as a result, you need a coordinative body, which is us, to ensure that there's no duplication of effort in silos, that we're all marching in tandem in regards to our objectives. And also, another thing that we deal with too is that our policies apply to a much wider audience than, say, in the private sector, right? We're looking at civilians, military, very different contexts, very different business lines. So a lot of stakeholders involved, which creates a bit of a lengthy process. So back to us, we are a subsidiary of the Chief of Military Personnel, who has the functional authority to create and implement policies pertaining to military personnel. So as a result, our group are the framework owners, which is our bread and butter. By framework, I mean, we ensure that the policy development requirements are met. So, ensuring that that we're doing enough research, that it's evidence-based, that we've clearly identified the issue. Is it a policy issue? Is it a process issue? Is it a gap from in between? Has there been a GB plus analysis? Who is our audience? And of that audience, what does the disaggregate data look like? We ensure that all the subject matter experts and stakeholders are connected. We're always tapping into various diversity groups internally and externally. We have a division of human rights and diversity. And of course, we got legal advisors every step of the way giving us our risk analysis. So it's internal as well. We have military lawyers that take a look at things that we take advice from. We also have the Canadian human rights advisors that we engage with as well. And of course, as when you're developing any policy, to avoid any kind of blind spots, you want to make sure that you're tapping into your users and the implementators, those who own the software and the applications to roll out the policy. And with that, of course, you need an effective communications plan, right? So, and that's also a bit of a challenge given, again, how big our organization is, just to get the reach out there. But overall saying, our policy development life cycle and its best practices have been leveraged from industry and tailored for D&D relevance. So real quick, another little thing that we do too is we're governance facilitators, ensuring that all the stakeholders are getting together regularly from all levels of the chain, so down to the worker bee level to leadership, and ensuring that everybody's coordinating their efforts collectively. And again, not duplicating any efforts. So we also do training to various policy cells within D&D and corporate reporting. So all that being said, I like to think I've already kind of shed a lot of light as to how we develop this policy and as well our other policies. Next slide, please. So background, I like to give a bit of a disclosure here first, despite what can be inferred from the media sound bites, I always like to first say the CAF has never condoned any kind of hateful conduct or sexual misconduct, right? It was never allowed. We have like a code of ethos, professional conduct documents, right? And I also like to say that much of the negative conduct that was presented in the media is not exclusive to the CAF and is apparent in society at large. The great news about all this negative media attention is that it helped prioritize the positive change and modernization needed within the institution. So really what kind of started this all off was back in 2018, the Canadian Armed Forces Military Police produced an internal report called White Supremacy, Hate Groups and Racism in the Canadian Armed Forces. And it provided an examination of MP reported incidences that were, occurred between 2013 and 2018. The findings were that 51 CAF members were either found to be part of a hate group or undertaking actions or making statements which could be viewed as discriminatory or racist. However, in all cases, no criminal wrongdoings were uncovered. But again, this was just a great starting point to have that internal reflection and see how we can, fix some of the gaps within the institution. Next slide, please. So this was generally leveraged from the public health model. And you can see the three-pronged approach that we have to things. And at the end of the day, it was all about communication and support, at all areas within the chain. So from the soldier to the commanding officer to leadership, we wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of signs to look out for and how to respond. We're from a hierarchical structure, so it's uncommon for anybody to go outside of their chain of command to report on anything. So a lot of this in tandem with other initiatives that we're having is just providing enough support and tools for everybody out there that these issues might touch on, and to not be penalized in any way for speaking up or actioning wrong, hateful, misconduct type behavior. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just an example of what our policy approach was. So as I mentioned, we're a very large organization. So we have a great deal of policy speaking to many different things. And as I've learned, being in the policy realm, the smallest change, like the smallest word change, has a ripple effect in all these other policy instruments and the process itself. So that small change still requires a robust communications plan to make sure everybody's on the same page and that we have a standardized approach to implementing the policy. So real quick, we took one of our higher form of policy instruments, which was the conduct and performance deficiencies. And that's where we introduced our hateful conduct definition, as well as the policy statement, the requirements and consequences that go along with it. And then what we do from that, that's a higher level order. We have an instructional document, which kind of just, is a little more, as it states, instructional, procedural, almost at an SOP level to provide good guidance to the users. Next slide, please. So this is just a look here at the definition of hateful conduct. Like a lot of the other movements we've had in the past, you run risk of collapsing the categories and definitions. So there was a lot of internal debate about what is hateful conduct versus harassment. We really knew that we wanted to zero in on things that were criminal and deal with that. But through extensive consultations, again, with the researchers, the legal advisors, like DND has their own research group filled with scientists. We have strategy people filled with scientists. Everybody has a pulse on, the various latest research in academia, as well as their own experience to help kind of feed the policy. Legal advisors, internal and external, as I mentioned before, and that's how we landed exactly with the wording here. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the Venn diagram. We had the three components, and then the conditions that must be met for hateful conduct to occur. So we have it right there. Was the incident related to an act or conduct? Was it directed at a person of an identifiable group? And did this person, conscientiously know or ought to have known that the act or conduct would justify or promote violence or hatred? So just to give you a little bit of context there. Next slide, please. Perfect. This is another tool here just to kind of provide clarity to our organization, right? So there was a lot of questions about what's what. When do I action something? When should I be speaking up? When do I let something go? Do I let something go? So again, this is just one of the communication products that we've produced out there, disseminated amongst the organizations, just to give them a little better sense of what hateful conduct entails and how to action things. Next two slides is basically just excerpts that we have that have no person instruction. We reference the criminal code, and then we just kind of detail exactly what constitutes the hateful conduct, right? So the statements, participating activities, right? None of these bullets are lost on this audience here. Next slide, please. Yeah, there's a little more, right? So acts of violence or intimidation stemming from hate. Oh, no, it's perfect. We can go to the next slide there, Tracy. Excellent. And here's another example of a communication graphic that we created. So just for the different kinds of audience, we all know that everybody digests information differently, and again, the intent isn't to crucify those who fall in the yellow, but to teach and bring more awareness, provide course corrections, throughout the CAF. And that brings me a good point as well, given the mandate of the CAF is that, that we take care of some serious threats on a global level, and with that comes a certain type of personality, or sometimes the exposure that our members experience, out on deployments and on missions, changes them, profoundly. So just another example is that we're looking at all different areas of business and support to our members. So when members come back, from a deployment, they may have seen something that might kind of highly influence their characteristics and personalities. We try to, have that decompression in there and give them the support that they need to kind of bring them back to baseline. So we're looking at layers everywhere on a micro level because we realize that's the level of effort required. And as we're doing that too, we're trying to align it with all the other initiatives and modernization efforts that we have on our plate as well. So reporting was the big one, right? We want our members to be comfortable to report and to know what to report on. So that was the big one. Same with the tracking as well. Leadership wanted to start having good sight on all incidences of misconduct. So we set up a whole a tracking system, which we leverage from the sexual misconduct tracking system, just so we can do more corporate reporting up to leadership and they can have sight of what's going on. And our leadership wants to know all forms of misconduct, no matter how small, just so they can have a good assessment of the internal environment. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's a lot of attention from senior leaders on the tracking system. And as our audience is well aware, the data that's produced from these tracking reports definitely informs future policy development and the reviews of the current policies that we have. So we understand that there's always blind spots. There's always more research that's coming in. So we try to make it a point that whenever we have a policy go live, we just don't forget about it. We continue to monitor it. We have the research folks always feeding us new studies, new information, and things that help shape our future versions of the policy. Perfect. So this is just like an example here of the various communication tools that we've used. So we've had it in our CAN for Gens. We have it on our website. We have it in our DOD. We have a MILPERS instruction. We have the Maple Leaf. And we're constantly, trying to develop new products and liaise with the other organizations who are tapped in to our soldiers on the ground, just to let them know exactly what the HQ intent is, what the policy is, and again, just to empower them as well, members as well as commanding officers as well as leadership, so that we can continue to preserve and advertise the positive image that the Canadian military has this reputation for. So as I was mentioning, we're continuing to monitor and evaluate all of our policy ongoing efforts. The research is still coming in. So I'm very happy to be sitting here at this table with all these academics and new sources of information that we can, that can help feed us into the right direction moving forward. Yeah, I think the next slide was the question slide. So I'm ready to go here. Any questions from the group? Fire away. I'm ready to hear it.
I think we'll hold all questions to the end just to make sure that things don't snowball and we lose track. But Emil, I want to thank you for that. That was an absolutely incredible introduction and overview. Provided some really solid context for us, I think, to help us all understand where the policy has come from and what the nuts and bolts are as well. So just absolutely wonderful way to set the stage.
Fantastic. I'm very happy to have hit the target there for you.
Absolutely. Good. And now I'm going to turn it over to Carmen, to Dr. Celestini, who will talk a little bit about what she's been finding in terms of, existing policy frameworks and potential ways forward as well. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I have to say that that was an amazing presentation on the policy. And many of the things that you said are the things that I've encountered in sort of doing the research for the background of this. And one of the ones that really hit home is the idea of how large this organization is and how it impacts every little area. And there's an engagement from every autonomous group within the military that I've spoken to, which is important because I have noticed that everyone is very engaged in this topic and really wants to participate and build a more fluid and a larger sort of policy and ideas around this. Now, one of the main things that in my discussions with various military groups and partnerships is that there's this idea of, as the policy stands now, it is very much very punitive. So what happens if we find this? What are the implications and how do we recognize it? One of the things that seems to be consistent through the conversations I've had is that they would like to talk a bit more of a culture policy, more of a social policy, and how we engage as a larger group and together to understand hateful conduct and to understand extremism. And with that, and because of the large nature of this, is the idea of creating a layering effect with this social policy or culture that is being created, so that an individual from the point of recruitment to training to actually going out on missions, perhaps if they're promoted, and most importantly, when they become a veteran and they leave the military. And so the layering effect of understanding the social policies and creating a culture of awareness is really important. And so I know I've spent way too much time in COVID cooking, but the best explanation I can give for this is sort of looking at it as, layering in the first layer of spices and the next layer and the next layer. So there is a consistent understanding. As we've spoken about, there is a lot of change that happens with hateful conduct and how it is approached, how individuals are approached, and how the language is presented to individuals. So in the discussions that I've had is that the training should be for the entirety of a person's tenure within the military and in a preparation for when they are not in the military. So some of those tools could be looking at how we understand how military people are approached, how conversations are engaged, and what to recognize, because not always is the hate speech or extremism something that is very recognizable. Current research is showing that a lot of hateful language and racist rhetoric is actually being approached underneath political memes. And so, it's engaged in this. And we can see that definitely during, what's happened in the last year and a half with COVID, people's engagement in such discussions are definitely changing and the envelopes are opening. And people who may not have been subjected to or even, interested in these types of topics, the expansion of this is definitely happening. So what we see is much of all of this being presented under a veil of politics, through a language of patriotism and through a language of freedoms. And so these ideas should be included in any training programs or policies that we have. So there's a notion of persecution, of personal attacks and nationality, and that leads to people's understanding of patriotism. So in some cases, what this happens is it feeds this notion of that you're fighting for something, which is inherent in the group that we're looking at, in the culture that we're looking at. A lot of the people that I've spoken to have said to look towards the sexual mixed conduct policy because it is much larger and really focuses on a culture and how to deal with that. So there are notions of victim impact that should be discussed and thought of in all of the training programs. So there have been discussions about training, and what has been one of the things that has been really spoken about is not just having experts and researchers and academics coming in and talking, but also having victims and people who have engaged in the community, as that victim impact could actually have more of it, the risk of using the word impact again, impact on the people who are in training. There are groups that are willing to work with commanders and higher level military people and engaging with that victim impact statement. So what we see is that if we can actually combine expertise with victim impact statements, which do not have to necessarily be on the higher level, what are the things that we are recognizing? What are the microaggressions and the things that are happening that can attract people to extremism or hateful contact? So we see that the idea of the victim impact and expertise is actually moving across different areas of the military. So I had an opportunity to speak with the Military Police College, which was an amazing conversation. And what I learned there is they're actually developing training programs in the college to actually address hateful conduct conduct, and they're engaging in that. So we can see that there are different areas in the military that are engaging, but how do we interact those things and put them together, I think is one of the most important and not easy tasks to do. I do feel compassion for you in that. One of the other things that I've also heard is that on this military police idea of understanding hate crime and how to deal with it and with extremism is the role of social workers and counselors in this process. So what is the policy that we want to include with that? So it's not just including them in the policy, but also providing them with the training. So I do understand that when someone comes back from a mission, that there are training programs or, the sort of decompression ideas that can happen, and helping them sort of change if something did happen and how to return back to outside of that mission area. But the social workers themselves and the counselors have to be trained to recognize what is hateful conduct, what is extremism, and most importantly, how individuals are approached, and understanding how to teach them to engage or not engage with that material, and most importantly, how to recognize it. There's a significant position to be taken here with using a public health model in these cases, which I know is used when people return from a mission, but engaging that public health model and mental health model throughout the process of a military personnel's career is exceptionally important. So with that, there is these ideas and notions of rehabilitation. So if someone is engaging in extremism or in hateful conduct, or being active in that, being rehabilitative is a very important part of this process as well, not just a punitive idea. So that is where also training for social workers and counselors can be engaged in the process. With that also is support with the social workers and counselors with those who are the victims of hateful conduct and extremism. Because the cases can be played out in the public sphere, and the reputation or the ideas of what is happening in the military with the CAF, one of the things that I've heard from groups who provide training and who work in this field is that developing more of an idea of transparency with these discussions, and looking at communications and following up with stakeholders, and having the stakeholders in some way engage with either the rehabilitation or with the punitive, and knowing how this ends, rather than having to search out material, having that material as part of a conversation with those groups. So overall, what I've understood is that there is a lot of time and a lot of finances that are spent in the effort in preparing our military personnel. And in this, we need to think about how we can take some of that and engage that training to help them transition from all of the different areas of their military career, but most importantly, when they're actually leaving the military. Now, what I do understand is that the Veterans Affairs Office is separate from the CAF, but there is engagement there. And in speaking to the Veterans Affairs Organization, what I've learned is that not a lot of military personnel actually turn to Veterans Affairs. It is a very small percentage of military personnel who engage with the department, predominantly as those who are seeking medical help or the benefits that are provided there. What happens from my engagement with the Veterans Department is that when a military person leaves the CAF, their definition of who they are as a person changes dramatically. So for your entire career, you state, I am a military person, and suddenly you are no longer that. And there's a family and a community that is created in the military. And so there is a loss and almost a sense of grief, and at times there can be anger when people leave the military. And if they aren't using the supports that are actually there in Veterans Affairs, then how do we engage with these military members? Because what we see is that these are the ones who are actually the ones who are susceptible to being approached. And they're being approached by different groups because they do have military experience, because they do understand how to organize, and they understand how to engage in a military operation. And so one of the policies that I think, which is not in the realm of which I'm working in right now, is working with Veterans Affairs to understand, there is a decompression conversation that happens when someone leaves the military. But if we can layer that conversation throughout their career, they may have some tools that they do not have at this point in time. And if we can train the people who do the decompression and the sort of exit interviews with individuals who are leaving the military and provide them with the tools and the training to help the military personnel who are leaving to understand how they may be approached, what to look for, and what resources are there for them to speak out about this, and to, that they can talk to someone and say that this is happening. Now, these things do happen in groups that are not part of the military. So, it might be a bicycling group, it might be a social group of some sort, where these type of conversations are happening. So it's really important for us in policy and in our training and creating that social culture that we provide everyone with the tools of training of what to recognize and how to report, even if you've left the military. Who are you reporting to and who do you talk to? So one of the groups that I have spoken to and approached is the Legion, because people do turn to the Legion and have conversations there. And I think as a support mechanism, as you were saying, Emil, is very large, but this is something that happens outside of the CAF as well. And so, in a broader project outside of just the CAF, how do we work with the Veterans Affairs, and how do we work with the tools that the veterans are using, which are the Legions, and how do we train them, and how do we provide a mechanism, or at least a pipeline, for reporting and engagement, and in some way a word of warning in that way. So those are some of the things that seem to be really important with the communication, transparency, and training. And most importantly, a mechanism of listening to the military personnel. We see that they have an opportunity to decompress in the different parts of their career, but what is it that we should be listening to, and what are the key words and the key ideas? Most importantly, that I have found is what you have spoken to as well, and what Barbara spoke to, is about this idea of it continuously changing. So whatever training program or policies or group dynamic that we create with all of the areas of a person's military career, is that those things have to be continuously analyzed. How hate groups and extremists engage with people changes dramatically. And I mean, we've seen it just in this last year and a half. I mean, I'm not saying there's always going to be a pandemic, but we can see that the engagement is no longer sort of trying to, like with the White Lives Matters group, as an example here in Toronto, they actively engaged with the anti-COVID and anti-lockdown people, trying to put their protests together. They, in their groups and their discussions on social media, they made a rule that you cannot discuss racist topics or discuss this, but put it under a connection and creating a community with these ideas of freedom and patriotism and stuff. So that dynamic is continuously changing as the social milieu changes. And so whatever policy or training programs that we do put in place or do happen to evolve, it's very important to continue that analysis and engage with researchers and engage with those who are watching social media. And that is where the military police as well can come in. And where also the provincial polices and federal police can come in, the RCMP, because they are engaging on social media and seeing what is happening and the new processes. So we can have that change of engagement. So I think that's it for me. Thank you for listening.
Amazing, Carmen. Thank you so much. I think I was watching Emil's response.
Me too.
Resonating with him. So that's a good sign. You know, it really is about how do we operationalize the policies, in particular in building resiliency and building the capacity to respond and to create that culture that limits, I guess, the vulnerability, if you will, of personnel. I also like the fact that you focus in particular on, you know, in service and post service, and you know, you didn't really talk so much about the pre-service, or you know, sort of the entry and that sort of thing. And I think probably Yannick will talk a little bit about that at the end, but certainly in much more detail in a subsequent webinar as well. So I think a lot of important pieces there, Carmen. So I appreciate the work that you've put into that. So now, you know, you've talked a little bit about how to operationalize, and we're going to talk about, you know, a concrete context in which the policy is operationalized. And for that, we will turn to Dr. Okros. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To start, I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. I believe particularly for this session, it is important for us to be connecting the dots between the historical treatment of Canada's Indigenous peoples at the hands of the Crown, governments, communities, and individuals. I think we need to recognize and understand the history and the legacies that we have in Canadian society and how these influence people's attitudes and behaviors today. In speaking to you today, I'll fill in a little bit more of my background. One of the key things that I'll identify is that I had a full military career. So I did 33 years. I joined in 1971. So I'm 50 years of having been around working in this field. And as I've said in some other public comments, I've seen this movie a couple of times before. As a bit of context, I got started working on employment of women in the military in 1979, and I got involved in both research and policy development, predecessors of the organizations Emil's talked about, but issues of racism in the military in the 1980s, when we had folks like the KKK and Aryan Nation and others that were actively on bases recruiting. So got involved in the early efforts to update policy, address tattoos, the early investigations into the Canadian Airborne Regiment before they deployed to Somalia, etc. So I'm going to speak from two perspectives. One is as an academic and a researcher, and quite honestly, somebody with a fair bit of corporate memory and history. So I'll speak as an individual, but also talk a bit in terms of my role and the CPCC, the new Chief of Professional Conduct and Culture, and a little bit starting with why this new organization has been created. And internally within defense, again, this idea of it's a big complex organization, creating a new what's called level 1 organization is an important, significant investment and shift for defense. So I want to explain a little bit about why. And part of it is there's two reasons that I put forward. Across a domain of unwanted conduct, if I can put it very broadly that way, I think there's been a recognition over the last year to 2 years, first, that the efforts to address these have been somewhat fragmented, and that there's been a requirement for some better integration and coordination. And the second is that the understanding of the core issues has been incomplete. And I'll speak to some of what has been incomplete. And I'll speak to both the issues of sexual misconduct as well as hateful conduct. My comments are generalized, but I think they apply in both cases. The first is that our focus has tended to be on changing individuals. And part of what Emil put forward there, looking at the prevent, detect, respond, the focus very much has been on individuals. If we can educate them that they either understand how their behaviors are wrong or they understand as a leader what they need to do, the assumption has been that if we can change individuals, we can change the behaviors. What we've not been effectively understanding is addressing the social environment in which they are embedded. So yes, there are on occasions bad apples, but there's also consequences of putting good apples in warped barrels. And one of the things, particularly in the military context, is the military intentionally creates individuals. It intentionally creates the social environment, the culture. It has a lot of power and a lot of levers and a lot of tools. And the work to date has not necessarily really challenged that or looked at how some of the initiatives that can change the social environment. The next that I would suggest is that a lot of it is being based on addressing the symptoms rather than understanding key issues or digging down to root causes. And so as a result, again, we've tried to change things at a fairly superficial level, and then we're trying to figure out why is it that the long-term consequences haven't changed. And one of the key issues underlying that is a reluctance, particularly in the military, and as somebody with many years in, I'll say the we of the military, to name and challenge key aspects of military identity, of professional practice, and of daily functioning. And one of the key ones that starts with that is that it's recognized the military engages in very intentional professional socialization to convert the civilian into the soldier, sailor, aviator, to construct the leader, the commander. And we haven't really challenged these processes of social construction. What does the prototype ideal soldier look like? What is actually really valued and promoted and what is not? And there are issues internal with the military, and we need to be thinking about how these give rise to certain conditions. It's similar to some of the professional practices. Three of the things that are given significant importance in the military: obedience to authority, normative conformity, and group loyalty. These are absolutely essential for the military to do what it needs to do. But we haven't asked, how do these set the conditions for some individuals to feel marginalized, discriminated, shunned? And how does these set the conditions where other people feel the privilege and use power to actually engage with others, to put people down, to harm them, etc. So we need to be looking, I think, a lot more at the social conditions, social issues, and the daily practices. We've also not looked at racism or gender discrimination as a systemic level, not really thinking about it and understanding it in terms of at the national level, what is the systemic racism in Canadian society, at the institutional level across defense, and at local levels, at small teams, small groups, which is really where culture lives. The next of the things that we haven't really done well is actually something that a colleague several years ago, Ashley Bickerton, in a 2015 PhD thesis, which is looking at sexual misconduct in several countries. But she pointed out our tendency to create monsters. And by that, what I mean is categorizing those who engage in sort of abnormal, extreme acts as abnormal or sick, or there's something fundamentally wrong with them. And by making them monsters, it means that the institution doesn't have to look at what is the environment that attracted them or enabled them. And I think particularly in some of these cases, we need to be thinking about, who is attracted to join the military? There is research out there. It tells us there's a subgroup of people that score pretty high on things like right-wing authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, attraction to violence, misogyny. From a military or police, these are issues that need to be thought about and need to be confronted in a lot more way than to make the assumption that we have a bunch of, good, honest, normal citizens that want to join the military and somehow, somebody gets flipped or radicalized or turned. We need to be thinking, I think, at a little more significant level in terms of the dynamics that are going on. So those are some of the challenges and issues which I think have become more visible over the last year and a half. So I'll turn briefly to Chief of Professional Conduct and Culture and what the focus is and why. The first thing that I'll say with that is culture exists. Leadership and things like updates to policies and training, education and programs and punishment systems, reward systems. These all have the capacity to influence culture, but culture really lives at the small team level. And so one of the critical things that I think is recognized is we really need to be thinking about the leadership of small groups and small teams, and how do we enable leaders to be able to create the kind of culture that is articulated and desired. So with that, the idea of creating the Chief of Professional Conduct and Culture is to create a capacity for ongoing evolution of culture internally within defense. First point that goes with that is Canadian society is going to continue to change. The expectations of equity-seeking groups are going to continue to change. Quite honestly, social struggle is going to continue to change over time. So there is no status quo. There is no end state. There is no definitive picture of we need to look like this, and once we've got it done, our job is over. The culture internally needs to continually evolve to align with Canadian society, while also ensuring that we optimize the effectiveness of people that we charge with delivering defense. Second thing, a lot of the focus, and again, it was in what Emil had talked to, a lot of the focus is being compartmentalized internally within the organization, a significant amount on the military, not as much on the civilian members internally. And one of the challenges internal within defense is about 70% of civilians work and live on bases and wings that are predominantly military organizations. So there's a recognition we need to have a much more integrated approach across all of those in defense, and to get away from these artificial differentiations of military and civilian. So the organization is still in the process of being scoped and framed and defined. As Emil said, if you think it's fun trying to change the words in a policy document and see the ripple effects, try changing a brand new organization and see the ripple effects for everybody else's organization and their responsibilities. So I'll talk to three broad areas that CPCC is working on. The first one, of course, is culture change. And there is a mandate to develop a strategic framework for this ongoing culture change. So work is ongoing with that. There has been a lot of work that has been done trying to knit it together to come up with something that's going to be integrated. In areas that Chief Military Personnel and on the civilian side, our HR civilian organizations have been working on, there is requirements to do updates to both employment equity and diversity and inclusion plans. And there's been a lot of work done in recent years looking out to the private sector, particularly on diversity and inclusion. Looking at what can we do, what are the best practices, what can we learn from others. Certainly recognized in there that these intend to be have enhanced initiatives focused on anti-racism, on systemic discrimination, and as Emil talked briefly, to using gender-based analysis plus as an analytical tool to help understand different subgroups, different individuals, those who may be experiencing their careers in different ways, may actually be affected by policy in different ways. We need to be much better at using GBA plus to really do those kinds of analyses. There's going to be continued updating to professional development, the content of courses, what people are developing, as well as performance appraisal. Those are two key critical components of ensuring that people have the right knowledge and the right skills, and then assessing them to see whether they're actually putting them in practice. One of the challenges that we've had is most of the focus for the last 4 or 5 years has really been on preventing negative behaviors. And we've not spent as much time on articulating the positive culture that we want to create. So this is one of the areas that is being looked at, and one of the initial areas that people are looking at and landing on is a focus on inclusion and inclusive teams. And those that work in the diversity and inclusion area, the kind of concept or the idea that each individual feels welcome to bring their whole self to work. They don't have to hide parts of who they are in order to fit into the organization. And at the present time, that's definitely a factor in the military context. We need to have clearer articulation of the professional expectations of individuals. So there's work ongoing, updating what is called the doctrine manuals and the formal guidance on if you're going to be a member of this profession, here's what's expected of you. And to return to one of my comments, some work on looking at entry-level professional socialization. When we bring those civilians in and they go through that first entry formative phase, what are they really learning? What are they internalizing? What expectations, what beliefs, what understandings of norms and behaviors? What are they getting from that? And finally, a significant amount of effort going at looking at updating criteria for promotions internally. Certainly has been recognition that on occasions individuals have been advanced to higher levels who didn't necessarily demonstrate the professional aspects that the CAF wants to see promoted. So they're looking in those areas. That's broadly culture change. Second one, which is a major issue, I'll do a couple of comments, but there's a lot more I could talk to, but is justice and accountability. Recognition of the complaints process internally needs to be reviewed, updated, integrated. Emil talked to some of the issues of data and data collection so that senior leaders know what's going on. Again, I'll go back to the understanding the social environment. The reason people are not putting in complaints is because it isn't because they don't know what the form is or where to send it to. It's because of the social environment they were embedded in, the concerns about retaliation, about consequence to their reputation. So there needs to be a lot done in making sure that we set the conditions, and also that we need to look at the voices and ownership, particularly of affected persons when they put in a complaint, because at the present time, they can easily lose control, agency, power, and the quote system just takes over and they end up in circumstances they don't want to be in. Similarly, there certainly are initiatives to update and modernize the military justice system, including providing increased professional development for individuals. There's a lot of recognition that many individuals need to get more understanding of trauma-informed perspectives, how to deal with individuals that have been affected by extreme behaviors. The third is the support to affected persons. As much as we want to make all of these harmful things go away overnight, they aren't. We have people who have been harmed. So I think most are aware of SMRC and the work that they have been doing, the Sexual Misconduct Response Center. There's, as was announced in the last budget, there's continued expansion of their scope and services. They have up until now been focused on the CAF only, and will actually be expanding to provide services for civilians and working with VAC on veterans. They're expanding the types of services that they're going to provide to people. And there's also work going on with Veterans Affairs on peer support programs. And I think going to one of the key points that Carmen made of the recognition of the transition when people leave the military, they don't leave their military identity behind. There needs to be ongoing work with individuals, and particularly those that have been harmed, and recognizing, and this is other areas where work that's going on, but recognizing on many occasions, it wasn't just that somebody said something offensive. This opens up the whole area of moral injuries, and how do we recognize moral injuries, and what do we do with individuals that have been subject to those? So that's my quick tour through of some of the issues that have led up to the creation of CPCC, and some of the key areas that are currently being worked on in terms of initiatives to advance culture change. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Ellen. I mean, it really does, you know, sort of elaborate on that. I think that through line that we've heard from all three speakers now, and that is the importance of the culture in terms of enabling, you know, vulnerability to recruitment by the far right. Both at the organizational and the local level. And I think that that was a really important point. What is the role of local leadership? It's not something that we have heard much conversation about. It's been sort of at the higher level. So I really appreciated that. The other piece that I really appreciated was emphasizing not just those who are engaging in hateful conduct, but also those who are being affected by it. And I think that, again, that's a population that's often forgotten. You know, we do talk a lot about it, well, recently in the context of sexual misconduct, but I think to understand it much more broadly is equally important. So I really thank you for that. I've learned so much in this this hour. So thank you to all three of you. I'm going to turn it over now to Yannick, who is going to moderate a question and answer period. And we've got considerable time, so we've only got a couple of questions so far. So don't be afraid, jump right in. And Yannick, if you maybe want to summarize your own thoughts and then turn to some of the questions that we have from the audience.
Absolutely. And I agree with Barbara that one of the key themes here had to do with change in institutional culture, with Emil giving us a very good roadmap as to what is being done, with Carmen some type of best practices, this layering of effort, the integration of roles of victims, thinking about the difference between punishment and rehabilitation and the importance of bringing in social workers and counselors, the importance of transparency, but also the part of the puzzle which seems to be forgotten often, which is the post-service aspect and conceptualizing radicalization after service as a potential harm that comes as a result of service, and therefore the implication that comes with that. And then I think Alan did a fantastic job in giving us a great deal of food for thought as areas of further research, which is necessary, particularly when we're thinking about social environment, looking at this kind of notion of symptoms rather than focusing on the root issues in this process of socialization. What are the potential risk factors? What is it that makes radicalization in the armed forces potentially different than radicalization outside of the armed forces, and whether there is that difference? Now, one of the, and I'm going to abuse my privilege as moderator to ask the first question, as is often customary to do so. But one of the things I'd like to kind of push the panelists to think a bit about is, how do we define success when we think about change in culture in this organization? And more specifically, I think even more importantly, how do we measure success when it comes to these particular efforts? So I don't know if perhaps Emil would want to start with taking that, or anybody else for that matter has any thought on these two.
So that's a good point there, Yannick. You know, and our institution has very much prioritized performance measurement. That comes with every kind of breath, whatever our policy intent was. So just to ensure that there's not some of these gaps down the road that we're experiencing today between the process and the policy, it's measuring the policy intent. So we have a section that's stood up for macro corporate performance measurements, and now we're embedding that more in the policy cells themselves. So, and this all goes back down to data collection. You know, what's the information telling us that on the ground? You know, I mentioned we have that science research group. They have these surveys that they're sending out to members. We got exit surveys. You know, and another litmus test is you know, the legal challenges we get, as well as, you know, what the social media sound bites are as well. So we got a pulse on you know, on all the indicators, creating more with the stand up of all these initiatives. So I don't know, does that answer your question? Oh, I see Carmen's got her hand up.
Well, I think that mine is a much broader sort of concept outside of the policy as well, but that if a measure of success for me is sort of this concept of politics of becoming. So if we can create a room where, as society changes and we are more inclusive, and as the development of inclusivity occurs, that we have the policy and the ability to engage and be proactive rather than, you know, engaging with something afterwards. I know that that's a hard thing to do in policy, but I think that creating a social culture where the changes in society can be reflected in the policy and the military, and the ability to have voices spoken and to engage with what is happening in society and being proactive would be important, and that people can speak out and engage with that. I think that would be a measure of success.
So I'll follow on if I can and suggest that we need to be thinking in particular about those who are in marginalized groups internally. We have to be cautious when 80–90% of the people in uniform say that, you know, things are good, because it only takes a small number of people who are being adversely affected. So I think one of the things, again, that leadership is recognizing is the importance to hear lived experiences, and particularly to hear lived experiences from marginalized individuals. Now, that requires us to get some understanding about on what basis do people end up feeling and perceiving that they're marginalized, and this is part of where diversity and inclusion initiatives go, that they don't have a strong sense of belonging or attachment to the group, to the institution. I think those are important things that we need to pay attention to. At the present time, there are some measures that are looking at that, but by and large, and again, I know quite well to go to Barbara and the acronyms, DGMPRA as the Military Personnel Research and Analysis folks. I'm quite familiar with sort of what they're working on and the measures that they're collecting, but we need to be cautious that in measuring where a lot of people are in the organization doesn't reflect where everybody else is. So measures of success to me is when significant numbers of those that are in currently marginalized groups feel that they truly belong and they're truly supported. And that's not where they are right now.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question from Kieran that essentially asked that that articulates that in the past, extremist and hate-based behavior were reported, but not necessarily addressed with the same seriousness as they are now, and whether it is possible to find commonalities in those historical reports to guide prevention and intervention today. So is there any lessons that we can learn from past incidents to guide us in our way future?
Okay, I guess as the one that's been around the longest on looking at this, I'll try to tackle this one. So I would offer a couple of things. I mean, there certainly there were lessons learned from previous attempts, and there were issues that, there were approaches that were taken that worked well. For example, the recognition that we need to be very careful with language and terms when we use them, particularly when it comes to formal policy, but in professional development, etc. One of the things that I think is recognized, and I'll go back to my comment that culture lives at small team level. So one of the things that has been recognized is leaders at all levels need to be equipped with the right language, with the right tools, with the right ability. And from there, the challenge that we constantly have with this is between, and this applies in the military, but applies in most workplaces. It's the challenge between our tendency of dealing with incidents with a degree of confidentiality, a degree of initial low-level intervention. So the question is, when do you have the circumstance that you simply take somebody into the office and close the door and have the discussion with them? The challenge, of course, is when you do that, nobody else necessarily knows what's going on, versus when do you go formal and make it a big complaint and a big investigation. And I would suggest that's been one of the things that the organization has been struggling with and continues to struggle with, dealing with it early, low level, confidentially versus dealing with it publicly with transparency and with significant consequences. And one of the things that we do know is when you push more that it's got to be the formal with clear consequences, we know that people choose not to see and choose not to report because of what the consequences are to individuals. So it's going to be a constant struggle in getting the balance right.
And Emil, I was wondering if you could speak to that question as well about kind of what is the role of these historical events or historical incidents in guiding the policies that are created by DMPPI.
Well, the role of the lessons learned and best practices is to mitigate a repeat instance in the future, right? So usually our role is just to involve all the players, and collaborate and brainstorm as to how we can prevent that in the future and support, the people where necessary. Hey, but since I got the talking stick, I just kind of wanted to speak to some of the comments made by some of the previous speakers, which were excellent, by the way. Carmen, especially when you mentioned how how certain groups are really politicizing the issues and how that's not getting us into the solution space. I just love how you acknowledge that. There is a lot of politicizing of everything. And unfortunately, with our leadership, they have to react to a lot of things like that as well. And it's our job to kind of give pushback after we do some research and say, like, what, this is not really the issue. The context doesn't apply. So you kind of armed me a little more with that. It was really good. And just to kind of speak to you about the veterans and their transitions, I'm so glad you're aware of that. The CAF became aware of that a few years ago and stood up an L1 organization, as Alan said, prior to this one, called the CAF Transition Group, to do exactly what you were saying the concerns were, versus us just like discarding our veterans and being there with them along the way as they transition into their next life, and giving them the guidance that they need to go on. Because you're right, in the past, they've been on their own. They didn't know where to go, what to do, right? So there is that group. They're currently looking at functional areas and the policy space they can go into, which is really good. And just to kind of speak on that as well, I know we got the hateful conduct, sexual misconduct, all the social justice stuff coming up. It's all coming up right now. We got all these different strategies that speak to total health and wellness, policies that'll speak more specifically to mental health, suicide prevention. We have an adaptive career path initiative as well that's going on, which is re-looking at our employment model. We want to make sure we have our ducks in a row and understand exactly what the issues are before we start opening up the National Defense Act. So yeah, and we're trying to just get into that solution space faster, right? Especially with the equity, everybody's trying is speaking their story and explaining their history. And instead of getting everybody queued up to have their turn, we're just trying to get into that solution space faster. So just going it back to you, Alan, I love how you guys are looking at the selection board process, right? The promotions process, any area that can be gamed or you have some slippage in terms of character assessment. I can tell you that our leadership has informed us that they're looking at a more character-based, promotion system. How that would look, I don't know. It's a total gray area and subjective. But, it all goes back to that philosophy. If I give a person power, I'll show you their character. And I'm going to bring it back to how it's not exclusive to the CAF. Humans tend to be tribal by nature if you look at history. And if you throw that into a hierarchical system, like a fraternity or a competitive sport, if you have a shady character as your leader, it just kind of ripples on outwards. So I just wanted to say hats off to some of the areas that you guys are communicating and sharing. And again, Alan, I can't wait to talk to you down the road as you guys push forward on some of your initiatives. That's it for me there. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
Alan, Carmen, would you like to respond while we wait for our audience to pose more questions? And for members of the audience, please do free to send as many questions as you want through the Q&A feature on Zoom.
I think that it is important for us to look at the history and how it was addressed. In my conversations with groups who have engaged with the military about hateful conduct or extremism from a position of being engaged with it or having it occur with them or to them, they bring up the past and how that was engaged with, or the lack of transparency or the lack of answers that were there. And I think that it's not just a learning process for the development of policy and what we should be looking for, but it also provides a teaching moment for us to understand how we articulate things and how we communicate and what are the areas of transparency. So engaging with those individuals who were affected by past events that were addressed or not addressed, I think that those are the voices that we should be engaging with to learn how to be transparent and how to engage. I think that, as social media is something that we're all engaged in, we hear the voices of veterans. We hear the voices of people who are in the military. We hear the voices of the people who have been affected. And I think that also gives a perception of how people understand the military, both the civilian side and both the actual people who are in the engaged in the military. I think that we always need to learn from history. And so from that, we can build new policies, we can build reactions, communications, and transparency, and ensure that the voices that may have felt unheard in the past now have that ability to be heard. So that way we can create an environment where people do feel more comfortable in speaking out and engaging.
The other one, if I could, and again, going back to sort of what we can learn from history, one of the interesting areas that I think is informative of this actually goes back to the late 50s, early 60s in the US. And this comes into particular the work of Sam Huntington and Morris Janowitz. And it still influences militaries, and including the Canadian military today. And one of the central questions in there is, given that the military has got a very unique role to do, we expect folks in uniform to do things that we don't expect average civilians to do, and we actually don't want them to do. But given the unique role, should the military also therefore be a unique institution with its own unique culture? And to what extent, therefore, should the military be kept apart from society and social influence, which was Huntington's argument, versus Janowitz's argument that the military needs to be a part of society. And so the issue about what is unique and what is different within the military versus how open and permeable should the boundaries be of social influence coming into the military is a really important issue. And again, if you put it in a framework of a profession, and all professions practice professional closure, they put boundaries around their profession and they don't want other people coming in and telling them how to practice their profession. You can see it with medicine, you can see it with law, you can see it with policing and the military. And that's a constant struggle that's been going on. And so there are continued to be narratives internally, and I think it's important for us to pay attention to the narratives of what do military people tell themselves of who are we and what are we here to do and what are the real values that we want to live by. And there are disconnects right now in certain areas in the military. And again, back to I think some of what Carmen's been talking about, we need to be thinking about what some of those narratives are and how those who want to flip those narratives, to use those narratives to twist them and tweak them. Like I saw one literally about 4 weeks ago that was a very nicely written document that had a whole bunch of the Proud Boys narrative in it, nicely woven in, you know, but it was aligning with a dominant narrative internal within the military. So we need to be thinking about this, and that's why I think one of the key things to me is moving away from this idea of the extremism of there's something extreme about this individual or this ideology, to recognizing how some of these narratives are being woven into mainstream conversations within certain groups within the organization, and how those make people then vulnerable to some of the ideas that are being promoted.
If I can, I mean, I think that's an incredibly important point. I mean, I think you articulate it much better than I do, but this idea of, you know, people putting memes up that are very political, that are actually articulating language of hate or language of extremism, where if you're not aware of that, it seems something that's appealing to your nationalism or appealing to your patriotism. And, you know, it's an individual idea. And, you know, as to the culture of the military, I mean, patriotism, you know, is a very important aspect of this. And I think that, you know, that language appears all over. It's not something that is specifically with the CAF. I mean, my research in conspiracy theories and social movements, we see that happening, and that's how, you know, sort of moral panics happen, and how we have to deal with the moral injustice that comes from those moral panics. And I think that is something that we have to look at in our policy in creating the social culture. And, you know, what you've been speaking to, Alan, about, you know, leadership and how that engagement happens, and, you know, speaking out and understanding that, you know, it always isn't the most extreme image that you can think of when it comes to hatred or to extremism, that, you know, it's very much like an envelope opening up, that it's, you know, small steps and small things that you can relate to and that you can engage with that sort of take you down this greater path.
Yeah, so I think the comments that Alan and Carmen have just made do speak quite well to one of the questions that we've had in the Q&A, which is about how does this policy, or what are potential of this impact of this policy when it comes to discussing different political opinions or different point of views amongst members of the CF, and whether this might have some type of, you know, chilling effect on public discourse or kind of open and frank conversation. So I think you guys managed to preempt that question quite well. We do have a question as well here, and I'll read it as it's written. But essentially, it says, as part of cultural shift, I wonder why CCIR and SIR reports continue to identify gender and sometimes religion or race. Can anyone comment on the future change to identity respondent complaints? I think identifying gender, etc., perpetual cultural assumptions.
So I can speak to that a little bit here. There is an ongoing initiative, sex and gender modernization, right, for the markers, that was directed by Treasury Board. So we're having an internal look as to, where and when we're asking for sex and gender, taking in all the privacy concerns. Do we need it? We're asking ourselves, for certain forms. We already removed the requirements from certain forms, certain ID cards. So we're doing an internal cleansing of all that right now. Same with the language used in policy. It takes, again, because there's so many different L1s out there, there's a lot of different systems, a lot of different forms. So it's just a matter of getting everybody on the same page and executing, but the efforts are there and it is happening. And just, what I wanted to add a piece to the previous comments as well, real quick. In terms of what change is this fostering, what's it doing to the institution? And what I like to see is that, our CDS said that we're going through a reckoning, we're going through a bit of a reconstitution. The best things that I'm seeing come out of this, which a lot of my predecessors have cried out for, was transparency and accountability. And that's happening out of all of us. You know what I mean? And people want to see more ethical behavior from everyone and standing for what's right. So if there's anything that's made me less of a cynic, it's that observation within the institution.
I'll provide a bit more as a follow-on, and part of the question with this is when formal reports go forward, what information is being collected, and what are the consequences of doing that? And I think both in in the cases of who is the complainant putting the complaint forward, who is the individual that's being identified as having committed the act, there's recognition of the consequences of putting this information forward. So one of the things that is being looked at, and again, I think as most people are aware, the Canadian military is not alone in looking at these issues. Common for Canada, of course, to look at the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the Five Eyes, as we typically call it, generally referred to as the 5 countries divided by the different way we use the English language. But all 5 of the countries are actually at a very similar place at the same time with very similar questions. And having been around this for 40 years, it's the first time that's ever happened. Usually we've got one country saying, oh, we've got a terrible problem. The other country saying, we've already fixed it. And so one of the things in particular that comes up with this is, what are the implications of anonymous reporting? What are the implications of, instead of naming an individual, saying, there's something wrong in this unit, and let's go in and look at this at again, at a unit level, rather than we've identified this one individual and we're going to send the military police to go in and do a legal investigation. So there are issues with regards to what data is collected. Do people's names have to go on things? What are the consequences if we go to anonymous approaches to life? What are the implications when we shift it from looking at an individual to looking at more of the group context and the environment? And then the other one, which again, Carmen spoke to as well as Emil, but when we find things aren't quite right, how do you strike that balance between holding people accountable versus taking proactive interventions to correct it? And one of the models that people talk about is the flight safety world. And one of the consequences in flight safety is it's recognized there's a higher priority on preventing future incidents than holding people culpable for minor deficiencies. So, where is the balance here in terms of it's better for us to come in and take corrective action as opposed to going through legal processes trying to hold somebody accountable? And quite honestly, we've seen some of this playing out in the last few months with some of the cases that have got into the public domain.
Yeah, and on that note, just kind of push a bit further and returning some of the Carmen's comment, I was wondering if we could maybe explore in less abstract and more practical term what that distinction between rehabilitation and punishment might look like. So in what type of form could rehabilitation within the CF take place for individuals that have committed these trespass or various types of offense that would fall under the hateful conduct policy?
I mean, I guess I can go. In my conversations, one of the understandings is that I'm not 100% sure if this is true, but there is a perception that, just as we spoke of, that, you know, there isn't accountability, and it's like a reaction, and how do we deal with the situation? And by not engaging with that conversation or having that accountability, it could foster an area where people do not come forward or engage, because there'll be this perception that nothing will happen, that there'll be a larger instance, but these things could remain. And I think in the conversations that I've been engaging with, that's where the social workers and the mental health people come into this conversation, training them, and then engaging with the person who may have done something to actually find out what are the reasons why they engaged in this material. What was the thing that attracted them to it? You know, how do we understand that situation? Was it fear-based? Was it, was it the community or the social culture that they're in? And then addressing those issues as well, and trying to understand or provide that person with a method to not engage in that material, but still articulate those feelings or articulate that voice. So really, much as everything that we see in changes is that it's about mental health, and it is about social engagement and understanding the environment that someone was in and what they were trying to articulate with these motives, and ensuring that the person, there is transparency in what happened and what are the steps that are happening to rehabilitate and engage. So that way we don't silence other voices or create that sort of cynic idea that nothing's going to happen if I say something other than retribution to me. So creating a community like that, I think, is what I'm trying to articulate, and what some of the voices I've heard are trying to say.
I'll offer two comments if I can, and I'll offer these as an academic, not speaking on behalf of CPCC. I want to differentiate on occasions of these. I would offer, I think there's two important criteria to take into account in terms of what is the best approach with any case. The first one clearly is intent. When we have individuals who intentionally engaged in actions, there clearly are going to be greater consequences than from somebody where there is an understanding that there wasn't malicious intent. The second one, though, that I think is really important, and particularly, again, I would say in the military, but in the public service as well, is what I would call professional maturity. And what I mean by professional maturity is that, all workplaces have it, but particularly in both, there's an expectation that as you grow and develop in your career, as you're given increased levels of responsibility, you're supposed to have internalized the professional values. You're supposed to be much more capable of living in accordance with the professional standards. And so, the behavior of somebody that's got 2 months in the organization that says something inappropriate versus somebody that's at the 15-year mark, somebody that's at a senior leadership level, there's consequence. The consequences are different because, a bit of the phrase of you should know better by now. And so I think that's part that needs to be taken into account. And particularly in the military, it's a real challenge because, if you take 100,000 people in the military, generally speaking, you've got about 75,000 that are in leadership positions and 25,000 that are leaders in development. The role of leadership in the military is really important. And I think this is one of the real dilemmas people have got. If somebody engages in behaviors that violate professional standards, do they still have the moral authority to act as a leader? And this applies, quite honestly, to everybody of a commissioned rank as an officer, and on the non-commissioned member, everybody from Master Corporal and above. So it's a significant amount of the military. And I think that issue of what do you do with individuals, what role can they have, what leadership responsibilities can you give them after they have demonstrated, and whether it is intent or an error in judgment, how do you deal with it? And I think that's where the dilemma really comes between the rehabilitation and the punishment.
Emil, yes?
I'm going to borrow from Alan's playbook here and say, I'm not speaking on behalf of the institution. This is more of my personal philosophy that I'm about to share in regards to all this here. I found what has helped me in my job is just the personal approach. Connecting on that human level and hearing people's story and applying some understanding. And this goes a lot with what Carmen was saying before, and Alan with the history and stuff. Generally, as human beings, we're easily influenced. And given, the past elections and what's going on globally in the COVID, we're divided by propaganda. and essentially confirmation bias in the media. Right. So I found it's what we're all used to here is having the uncomfortable conversations, hearing people's story, getting the buy-in. And you know what? Usually, if you're not scrutinizing somebody in a public setting, they will get to that term of understanding and compromise. A reason why I do so good at my job is just having the one-on-one conversation, just hearing people out. You know what I mean? Removing any kind of form of judgment. But again, not crucifying the people who fall in the gray area of delinquency. You know what I mean? And recognizing, you know, that there is potential for rehabilitation. Sorry, and that's on the professionals. That's not me. You know, we've got a lot of psychologists and sociologists and, you know, healthcare workers, you know, and they're tapped into everything. Carmen's speaking to a lot of them too. And we're all kind of looking to get into that same space, you know, so yeah, that's it for me.
Very good. So we still have a good 10-15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions for the panelists, again, you're more than welcome to ask them via the chat function or the Q&A function. Barbara, David, I'm not sure if you have any questions yourself for the panelists. I've been monopolizing the moderation session for a while, so I'm happy to pass on the hat for a few minutes. I'm sure you have. Yes, David.
Oh, no, I was saying that it's your job to monopolize it as the moderator. But no, in general, I learned a lot here, and I just wanted this is more fluff than substance. I wanted to thank the speakers. I'm in the middle of writing a very speculative book chapter on the nexus between right-wing extremism and the Canadian Armed Forces. And it's nice to hear that some of the ideas I'm putting down to paper are being discussed, but at the same time, you've given me a lot to personally think about, particularly some of the stuff that Alan was talking about. I have my notes here somewhere, but I just want to thank you for a great presentation.
Okay, well, I think there's no questions coming in, so I think we're fine to wrap it up there. I just want to thank Ellen, Emil, and Carmen, all of you for sharing your thoughts, and especially in the question and answer, it really elaborated on a lot of the concerns that people have raised. So I really want to thank you so much for taking the time, and I am sure I'll be back in touch with certainly Carmen, but Emil and Alan as well. So much to talk about moving forward. Before we close, I want to give Yannick a few minutes to talk about a project he's on, just as a little teaser for our next webinar. This is sort of the introduction, and our next webinar, I think, will feature this work, which ties in very nicely with the conversations we've had today. And I think it was Alan you referred to, you know, our tendency to compare ourselves to our partners elsewhere, and that's something that Yannick is looking at explicitly as part of the network. So just going to turn it to him for a few moments before we close out.
Wonderful. Tracy, would you mind getting the PowerPoint? One. There we are. So yeah, very briefly, just for a few minutes, as we're going to discuss this in greater length at our next webinar. But myself, along with several colleagues at Leiden University, have received some funding from this network in order to do a comparative analysis of different national approaches to combating extremism within the ranks of 6 NATO countries. And if we can move to the next slide. And essentially what we see with media reports, with parliamentary debates, is that this issue of right-wing extremism within ranks of national military is not one that is solely a Canadian issue or a Canadian debate. We've seen several high-profile instances happening internationally. So the Program on Extremism at George Washington, along with START in Maryland, both released reports recently on the presence of veterans and enlisted service members during the January 6th insurrection. There's been great media coverage in the last year of the Franco A case in Germany. So a German officer who was planning a false flag attack, posing as a Syrian refugee. And this has also been reported on the Times X Day podcast, which is worth listening to if you're not familiar. I've also seen cases in the UK and the Netherlands, where I'm based, but also in France recently with the open letter that was signed by military generals warning of a potential upcoming civil war. So one of the things that we've tried to do is studying a series of case studies that come from both sides of the Atlantic, that's looking at the larger member of the alliance along with some of the smaller members. But also we pick these countries because they have a very diverse history and experience with extremism. We thought this would allow us to make some meaningful contribution. So on the next slide, some of the kind of the aims and objectives of what we're trying to do is we're looking at the different legislation, the policies, but also the regulations that deals with right-wing extremism within these 6 countries military. But we're also kind of stepping away from just this sample, desk research, looking at the policies itself and the letter of the law, but we're also evaluating how robust these policies and these legislations are. So looking at real life cases and how these have been addressed and seeing how effective these have been, whether there's overall coherence and transparency, but also the protection of due process as part of these efforts by these different countries to address this issue. And also, we're quite interested in the presence of invisible patterns, so using the law in context approach, trying to see if, for example, the history of these countries, the relation, the presence of populist parties in parliaments has any impact on how these issues are looked at, along with several other kind of societal issues. And really the importance of this research for this network and from some of our stakeholders is whether there's any kind of lessons learned that can be transferable or can be useful for what the CAF is trying to do right now with its own efforts. So we're hoping that we're able to arrive with some lessons learned, best practices, or perhaps some things to simply avoid by having this kind of wider transnational look. And on the next slide, just kind of talk briefly, this is something that came out in Carmen's presentation. I was very happy to see it, is the way that we are looking at this is that we're understanding that that there's various policies that are targeted at different stage of somebody's military career. And we're trying to make this distinction when we are looking at the various policies. So for example, the policies that deals with recruitment, with screening, with fitness, with aptitudes are looked at differently than the policies that take place during service. And as well as one of the aspects that's very important to us and we're very interested in is a post-service, essentially what type of support exists afterwards, both from the state itself, so from Veterans Affairs or something, but also from veteran rights group, from nonprofit organization, from de-radicalization organizations, which are quite prominent in Germany, for example, and whether they have any programs that are specific to look at these veterans. And the reason why we do this, that we're cognizant that the literature tells us that radicalization process amongst service members can be very different depending at the point of entry, whether they've radicalized prior to entry, rather they've radicalized during their service, or as a result of their service, or as a result of simply leaving the military and losing kind of the wider societal network and whatnot. And we think that kind of looking at these policies in these 3 stages can be quite helpful in kind of breaking down this puzzle. And then just for the last slide, essentially the reason why we think it's actually quite important from a NATO perspective to look at this, that at the end of the day, NATO presents itself as a community of value, and at its core of its mission, it's to defend individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, all things that are antithesis to right-wing extremism within a state organization. We also believe that the presence of extremist elements within NATO ranks can be viewed as a security threat, both for the state itself, but also for the wider alliance and as a threat to readiness and successful deployment. So we do think that while efforts to look at right-wing extremism in the Canadian military are very important, we should also start thinking about what our allies are doing and how they're dealing with this particular issues, particularly due to the integration of, or due to close proximity and joint efforts amongst NATO member states. And lastly, we believe that failure to deal with this problem can have some quite important impact, both as far as damaging the reputation domestically of the alliance, but also internationally, and also the functioning of the alliance. So as I said, this is just a very, very brief teaser of some of the work that we're doing, and we're really looking forward to share some of our findings coming forward in the next few months. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Yannick. Yeah, so as I said, that was a teaser to ensure that you continue to check our website for upcoming events. We hope to have our next webinar in the fall, where Yannick and his team can share a little bit more on their findings at that point. So I think that about wraps it up. I've thanked the panelists, and I want to thank you again. Just an awesome group that we brought together today. And thank you to all of those who joined us in the audience, the attendees as well, and for the questions that you posed to us. And don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us in the future if you want to further explore any of these questions or something that comes up to you after the event. Happy to engage in dialogue with you. So I will let you all go, and thank you for your time and your energy, and for making us think in different directions. So much appreciated, and hope to see you all again soon. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.